So often when new memoirists approach me with questions about how to market their memoir, the answer is, it depends. But I also know that is the most frustrating, non-helpful answer ever. And that's why today I want to cover the 6 components that are common to every single marketable memoir. Stay tuned. You've been writing your memoir, maybe even for years. You know your material, you know what it means. What's missing isn't the story, it's the structure. And that's why we started the Memoir Method Book Club. Every single month, Emily Thrash, a professional writer and editor, teaches you how to read like a writer by breaking down a published memoir and showing you what it's doing under the surface. Your first session is free. Head over to pageandpodium.com/book club to sign up. It can be so frustrating as an aspiring memoirist. Of course, you want your memoir to be good, but at the same time, there's always this kind of itching feeling that maybe good is not going to be good enough to get your memoir into the market. And that is particularly true if you are someone who is hoping for either a traditional deal or a high-end hybrid deal. So as we're kind of talking through here, I want to start by looking first at the distinction between what makes a memoir good and what makes it marketable. No, those are not the same thing. And then I want to talk about the 6 components that are always true. If your memoir is marketable, it will have these 6 components. And spoiler alert, as we get to the end, more and more of those will be about you. So you're going to want to watch all the way through this video. So to start out, I wanted to talk a little bit about what I mean when I say that a good memoir is not necessarily the same as a marketable memoir. And here I want to draw a little bit of advice from an excellent marketing book by Mike Michalowicz. Now, if you're not familiar with Mike Michalowicz, he is one of the top-selling self-published authors in the US and probably nationwide as well. He is a business book writer, not a memoirist, although his books do have excellent personal narratives to drive home their points. But the book I want to talk about today is called Get Different. Now, this is an excellent book to pick up if you are new to marketing. Any of his books are great. But the thing that I want to pull forward here is one thing that he says throughout Get Different, and that is, you will never be good enough to set yourself out in the market. Or, in other words, good is invisible. Now, this is a tough pill to swallow if you are someone who is trying to market something that you really deeply believe in, almost always the case with memoir, but it's also a really good piece of advice because it gets at this distinction between something that we might call good and something that's actually going to have some kind of a stance in the market. And I think that this distinction is actually really intuitive when you think about it, because we have all bought things, books and otherwise, that we had heard so much hype about, that we thought would be so good, there's no chance they're not going to deliver on the promise. And then when we actually got the thing, it was kind of mediocre, maybe even not that great, but it was still marketable. And at the same time, I bet you've had the experience of discovering the best kept secret in whatever industry it might be. Something that there was no buzz around, but when you got that product, book or otherwise, you could not believe that everyone hadn't heard of it. This is one of those kind of life hacks that get incorporated into your everyday life situation. And it's really exciting, certainly much more than something that's hyped up and not very good. But the distinction that we need to draw here with books is to remember that your book could very easily be one of the best memoirs literally ever to be written. And that would not guarantee that it's going to get picked up in the market, either by agents and publishers or by readers. So when we're talking about good versus marketable, I'm going to direct you to a different video for the good question. This is just about a month ago that I recorded this, and we also have it up on our blog, as all of these videos are written up into a blog post format by my right hand, Emily Thrash, who also puts her own spin. So you have tons of options for getting this information. Now, if you're looking for what makes a memoir good, that is exactly the title of that video from about a month ago. So hop back there and check that out. But when we're talking about what makes a memoir marketable, we're really looking for something very different. What we're looking for when we talk about a marketable memoir is whether that memoir is going to resonate in the particular market. Sometimes we think of this as audiences, but this is essentially an industry discussion. So we are talking about whether your book is going to fit into the market in a way that feels legible to the people who have to understand. Now, if you're talking about your book being marketable and you're going for a traditional deal, the people who need to understand the marketability are probably going to be either agents and/or publishers. It'll be agents if you're looking for a big five or other kind of really heavy hitting book deal. It might be publishers if you're looking for smaller publishers, those that are open to author queries. And it might be somebody totally different if you're self-publishing. This could mean that you need it to be marketable to your reader, which of course is true across the board. But it also might mean that it needs to feel marketable to any kind of advertising, promotion, support agency you might want to bring on to help you. In any case, we are going to want to make sure that we have answers to these marketability questions. And that's why I want to go through these 6 components. Most of them, if not all, are not going to change anything about the way you're writing. These questions are instead the way that you think about your book as a product. So we've talked before on this channel about how we can think about the creative mind, our kind of internal drive to tell our story, to express ourselves, to create. And that is typically what we think of during the writing and revision stage. At the other side of that kind of continuum is going to be the sort of productivity-minded place, the kind of market mind that we might go into when we have the final product that we are shopping around. Now, sometimes people are shopping around a book at the proposal stage. We talk about that in plenty of other videos. Check out any of our videos on publishing. But we always suggest that, especially if you are a first-time memoirist, it will be really difficult for you to get any kind of a book deal without a final manuscript, without a fully written manuscript. So we really do recommend that you kind of keep that creative mind in the writing and revising stage, and then you can fully shift once the project is finished, or as close to finished as you can get it by yourself. As you shift into the marketing place, you can kind of embrace that sense of the market and the promotion and getting out there and speaking to people. So as we're kind of moving through this, please do not change the way that you are writing unless it's just a little tweak or a turn or an angle or a clarification. And in fact, the main time that you will adjust something about your actual writing based on the market is just going to be toward editing and clarity, toward sharpening the singular message and singular topic of your book. So you'll get more of those specifics as we go through, so let's dive right in. The first component of every marketable memoir is going to be an identifiable audience. Now, I'm saying audience here, but I do want to add a little clarification that almost always we're going to be looking for a primary audience, one audience, as well as multiple, sometimes secondary, tertiary, etc. audiences. The thing I want to focus really on today is thinking about our primary audience and how you can kind of niche that down. So I want to start with an example that is from a current Memoir Method member. So shout out, you will recognize your story here as you are watching. So this client is writing a book about kind of exploring sexuality, exploring identity through sexuality, through relationships and that kind of thing. I don't want to give too much of a spoiler here, but there is a component certainly of sexuality. But the main component that we're thinking about is kind of how does our identity as women, how is that shaped by our relationships, by how we think about our sexuality, by how we think about things like motherhood, things like monogamy. How did those things go into how we see ourselves? And perhaps more importantly, how free we feel as we express ourselves to others and to ourselves. So this member had kind of brought in and kind of said, like, I really want to think about what my audience is. Now, she's pretty far through her memoir and is starting to think about this kind of marketing shift. So we did advise her kind of keep this on the back burner as you're writing, but it is an interesting conversation and I think helpful to really start to shift out of that creativity into the market. So as we were talking about this book, knowing her as a writer, knowing what her work reads like, knowing who she is, how she speaks, what her kind of authentic presentation is, as well as knowing what the book is about, we had a couple of different pieces of advice. So I always start kind of largest, And oftentimes this is going to be something like when you think about gender, age, sometimes regional demographics. That's going to be the really largest place that you're going to think about who your audience is. So as we were thinking about it, this is a very feminist book. So we certainly were thinking this is probably going to be targeting women. Since this is a book about her exploring her sexuality and her identity, and it is, again, very feminist, we know that we're going to want people who have a little bit of space to kind of reflect on their own identity. So we're thinking this is probably going to be mid-30s up to however old you'd like to be. But those two things are not really specific enough to really tell anybody how to market your book. There are so many women ages 35 to 70 that really there's not going to be any way that you can kind of niche in and figure out where those people are hanging out. They're hanging out all over, right? There's too many of them to really, in any kind of meaningful way, to really niche down just from that description. So then as we started kind of talking through it, I immediately identified one of my very favorite audiences, and that is the NPR audience. So we can take this women 35 to 70 and layer on top of that, okay, with the NPR audience, we can typically assume this is going to be a more liberal or left-leaning type of audience. They're typically going to be people who really want to learn. This is the NPR thing, right? They're wanting to discover new kind of facts and statistics and information. They want a really rich book in that way. We know that they're going to be looking for some kind of meaningful analysis. We know that they want to learn not only about the world, but about themselves. So we start to have all of these kind of pieces of this main audience. And while we can call those demographics, I find it much more helpful to think of them as psychodemographics. And all we mean by psychodemographics is that rather than just looking at things like gender, age, region, we are also looking at how these folks behave. So oftentimes, these are the type of people that will attend book clubs, be part of book clubs. Oftentimes, these are the type of people who are listening to podcasts. So that gives us a little bit of a hint of how we can get in front of them. Oftentimes, these are people who will attend things like women's empowerment conferences, women business owner conferences, all of these kind of places where we gather if you're kind of in this particular psychodemographic range. So one last hint that I want to give you as you're thinking about your audience, and of course then the other audiences that might be of interest, I want you to think a little bit about yourself. Because very often, you are a really good representative of who your audience is. Your primary audience will very often be the type of people who are wanting to learn about the thing that you already went through. So a really common piece of advice that I will give is to think about yourself before the events of your memoir. Where were you? What were you thinking about? Where did you hang out? What kinds of things were you Googling? What types of information were you taking in? That will be a lot of hints about where you can go in terms of thinking of your primary audience. When you get to your secondary and tertiary markets, don't forget that it can be very helpful to think about those extended audiences in terms of things like career and expertise areas. So in other words, in the case of this particular client, it might make sense to think about where are people going who teach others about this. So I think it might be useful to think about marriage counselors, people that are doing kind of relationship counseling, people that are doing counseling and coaching around finding a partner, as well as sex coaches, sex therapists, people who are thinking about this kind of thing all the time. So we might identify that as one of the secondary audiences. And then of course we have a lot of freedom in how we think about the other audiences and what they might be. But the purpose here is that we are thinking about an identifiable audience that we can get in front of. And with each of these components, I want to also give you just kind of a brief example of what non-marketable might look like, because sometimes I find that that's actually more helpful than the marketable examples. Okay, so this first example, this example of someone who did not choose an audience and did not have a clear direction for their audience. This was a client that I worked with many years ago, and he was writing a project that I do think is very rich, and it certainly could have been marketable, but unfortunately this client did not take my advice, so he was not able to get a book contract with this particular project. I think, by the way, that he's okay with that, but this is the way it goes. So his project, he had come to me with a project that was about his mother and his father. Now, they were a very, very unlikely couple, and in really interesting ways. They both had really rich backgrounds that connected to different kind of political backgrounds, and they also were just very, very interesting, ambitious people. So they had done a lot of things in their life. Now, if you have been watching this channel for very long, you know that we already have some orange flags going up. We already have a pretty unclear kind of central message and topic. But the bigger issue was that no matter how many times I would kind of push this client toward, well, who do we think the audience could be? No matter how many times I kind of gave suggestions of who I thought it might be, he was really insistent that his target market was everyone, that everyone could get something out of this book. And yes, I think he's right. Everyone could. But the problem is, when you're talking about pitching to agents, publishers, as well as marketing professionals, they all know that there is no way to reach everyone. It's not possible. And when we start talking about everyone, we basically take away all of the guardrails that would tell us what to do. Now, we simply have to throw spaghetti at the wall, again, trying to hit everyone. Rather, what I had recommended that he do was really drill down because of the political nature of this book, and because this is an NDA book, so I can't give you too many details, but because there was some scandal here, it was really clear to me that this kind of NPR audience, this audience that's really invested in politics, that's left-leaning, that's really interested in getting this kind of behind the scenes to understand how things work, it was so clear to me that that audience would love this book, but we simply were not able to make the case. I simply could not break through this misconception that everyone would be a good audience. And unfortunately, when you put together a book proposal for agents and publishers, you do have to define your audience. An undefined audience really makes a book unmarketable. And that's why the number one component of all marketable memoirs is a very clearly defined, very well identifiable primary audience. Okay, so then moving to the second component of every marketable memoir, this is going to be a really clear sense of whether your book is timely, evergreen, or both. Now, when we are talking about marketing strategy, very, very often the timeliness is the thing that we will fall back on. So this is natural, and it's actually pretty good advice. It's the reason that very often when things kind of blow up in the news, or when things blow up on trending TikTok or Instagram or whatnot, we see a lot of discussion about them, or we see a lot of copies of them. So that's often where people kind of go when we think about this timeliness, is oftentimes folks will say, oh, I want to make sure that I'm really tapping into XYZ current event. That's really good advice, actually. But you also can go the route of having your book pitched as sort of evergreen. So this might be things that are just continually an issue in the public eye. Right now, I would say mental health has been evergreen for some time, and I think that's a really good thing. We always know that particular things that are of interest to particular niche groups will tend to be evergreen. But we have to make sure that we understand how they're evergreen and why they're evergreen so that we can make that case. Most often, it is the case that books are both timely in some ways and evergreen in some other ways. And that can be a really helpful way to pitch. So here, the tip and the component is not something that you would have added or not added. It is, just like the audience question, something that you will use in framing your book as marketable as you're trying to get it out there. Now, I want to share an example that I have talked about quite a bit on this channel, and that is Wendy Davis's excellent memoir, The Fight You Don't See. Now, I've talked about this book before, but the main takeaway here is that Wendy's book is really about politics and the kind of current state of politics. So she wanted to go into a state level race and really go behind the scenes of her experience of running for a state level office. There are all kinds of things here that are really, really interesting, and I'll tell you, a lot of it really surprised me when I first read her book. But she is looking at things like gerrymandering, very, very timely. She is looking at things like political corruption, very, very timely. She is looking at things like inter-party fighting, very, very timely. And at the same time, all of these kind of political structures, she's pulling them back to the idea of structured power. And when we think about structured power, that's evergreen. That is always a conversation that we can have. It is always a place where people who are invested in more just societies are always interested in learning about that. So with that book, we have both a timely plug and we have an evergreen plug. And that is such a great way to set your book up for success, because when you do that, you have really opened the door for marketing professionals and publishers to take your book so far. And of course, a lot of this has to do with the fact that in Wendy's case, she was very, very well equipped to talk about both her own experience and the more philosophical, theoretical discussion of power structures. That means she is so well positioned to speak about this book at any time of year. It can be during that kind of election warm-up, or it can be not during an election warm-up. Although, if we're being honest, is that ever happening anymore? All right, so I promised you also that I would give you a non-marketable example here, and I want to share that. Now, this is not from a person that I ended up working with, but it is a very, very common example that I hear all the time, and that is a real resistance to editing. Now, I want to use a specific example. Again, even though this is in no way a call out, I hear this kind of thing all the time. But this was a pretty recent conversation that I had, and this was with a woman who was looking for a ghostwriter, and she really wanted to look at her whole entire life. Now, as I spoke with her, I did what I always do, which was kind of try to nudge and prompt her to see if I could get her to narrow down on one topic and one message. But unfortunately, she really insisted that we needed everything in the book because everything was important, everything was meaningful. She told me she had told a lot of these different stories to different people in her life, and they thought they were really exciting. So that was kind of driving a lot of where she was coming from. But the really big thing was that as we got through the conversation, it just was really clear to me that she was really resistant to cutting anything. And the reason this is a problem is that when we have your entire life to cover, there's going to be way, way more than one topic and one message. And when we don't have a clear topic and message, how do we know if it's timely? It's really just one person's story, right? So the thing that I want to really emphasize here is not that the idea of writing your whole life story is in some way bad. The thing I want to emphasize is that when you write your whole life story, you will very likely, as this person did, have many messages. You'll have many topics. You will have gone through many, 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 many things. And there is just simply no way to make a case that all those things together make one timely book or one evergreen book or one book that has both. When we have so many things, we basically have nothing. So as you are thinking about your memoir, if you are someone who set out to just put every single story into your book, if you have not spent a substantial amount of time really thinking about your topic and message, I want you to stop writing, and I want you to do that. Now, if you have not yet downloaded the Memoir Method checklist, you can do that at pageandpodium.com/checklist. And as part of what you'll receive when you sign up for that download, you'll get a video of me talking you through the development process. I want you to dive into that to get a little bit more information on what we mean by topic and message, just to make sure that you can come out with one topic and one message. And then we can move on to the step of figuring out whether we think it is timely and how, evergreen and how, or both. Okay. The third thing that every marketable memoir must have is comps. Now, this is a big piece when we're thinking about querying traditional publishers and or agents, because when we're thinking about doing any of those things, we know we need a book proposal. And one of the absolute most important parts of a book proposal is that you have comp titles. Now, what a comp is, this, by the way, is short for either comparative or sometimes competing, whichever, we usually just say comp. What we're looking for is making sure that the book is both common enough to be identifiable in a particular genre or type of book, and unique enough that it can stand out. Now, you might hear those words that I started this video with from Mike Michalowicz echoing through, and that is that being really good is not going to be enough to get you seen. When we are really, really good, we typically blend in. We need that something different to really grab people. Now, this does not have to be some major wackadoo thing. This often is actually something that you already were planning to do, and we just need to pull that out in that pitching stage. Oftentimes, if we've got to make some shifts, we can usually do that in the revision stage, especially if you went through that development stage and really did a good job with all of that. Usually we're just making a little tweak. We're just kind of re-angling a little bit. Let me give you a couple of examples of how this might or might not look. So the first example is one of our former Memoir Method, former coaching clients, Maggie. And her book, I think I've talked about before, is her journey of recovering from substance use disorder. She had a problem with alcohol. So she's telling this story of recovering from substance use disorder. I can tell you, there are many books like that out there. But what makes Maggie's book so special is that her approach to sobriety is not the all or nothing black and white that Alcoholics Anonymous and other types of organizations like that do. Instead, she advocates and works with her clients to figure out ways to deal with alcohol in moderation. She's looking at something that is both pretty common. We all have heard stories of people recovering from alcoholism, and something that's really unique and frankly pretty exciting. And this is really all we're looking for. What is that unique thing that makes the book stand out from the market without reshaping the book into something that no one can even figure out where to put on the bookstore shelf? We really need the balance of both, the familiarity of a genre as well as the specificity of your particular contribution. Now, to offer a non-marketable example, I want to blow things up a little bit, and rather than talking about one specific book, I want to talk about the two ways that you might get this wrong. The first of those is we might go way too far into trying to be common, trying to feel familiar. Now, I often see this with people who are so afraid that their book won't count as good if it's not like other books that have already been called good by some external source. So often the New York Times, even just a book contract. But really what they're looking for is to replicate the things that made these other books good. And often in doing so, we lose all of the specificity, all of the kind of author's perspective and voice and unique contribution. So if you are someone who is kind of looking through books and looking to make templates, if you are somebody who is trying to kind of copy someone's voice because you think it's really good, let me strongly discourage you from that. It will not serve you. Now, it can be really useful to look at existing books that you think are good and figure out what works and what doesn't. Look at kind of the structure, look at the things that are impactful. That, in fact, is a really great exercise. We call that reading like a writer, and it is, in fact, part of our new offering, the Memoir Method Book Club. You can check that out at pageandpodium.com/book club. But that is not the same thing as trying to make sure that your memoir matches every single detail of all of that week's bestsellers. That is not what we want to do. We want to make sure that we are just looking at what works and interpreting it in our own way. Now, the other way that you might go too far is to really resist any of the things that you see as kind of cookie cutter or conventional, and really try to make sure that every single thing you write is outside the box. Now, I have seen this in different ways where people went too far, but it usually is that they're trying to make every element different. So often it will be something like they, don't want a traditional narrative structure. They want kind of a really specific, really kind of interesting, unique chapter structure that is not chronological, does not have a normal narrative flow. It's sometimes things like they want a really kind of extreme out there voice, or a voice that really doesn't really match the genre. So for instance, somebody that wants a straightforward business book, but in the voice of Malcolm Gladwell. That's gonna be a little bit odd. You could do that, and I have seen it work, but you've got to have all the other components in place for that to even have a prayer. So I think you get the idea. Oftentimes, if we go too far to the unique, we are intentionally trying to distance ourselves from the familiar. That's going to be too far. We are not looking for black and white thinking here. We are looking for a simple balance between how you see your book fitting in the market and how you see it adding something new. So what's your balance? How can we make sure that we communicate? This book is unique, but it's not so unique that readers won't know what it is. That's the balance that we're looking for here. Okay, the next component that I want to talk about is author credibility and expertise. Now, just earlier this month, we put out a video and the accompanying blog post that talked about how you can think of yourself as an expert, as a memoir writer. I find that this is such a challenge for folks who are really new to this world of promoting books, promoting themselves, promoting a message. And oftentimes, all it takes is kind of a mental reframe for what makes an expert. So go back just a few weeks to that video if you're not sure what I mean here. But the main point that I want to make is that as you are looking for marketability, especially with any type of nonfiction, including memoir, this is often going to hinge on whether you, the author, are credible or have expertise. So how do we kind of think about how to do that? Well, one example that we might give is an example that I mentioned in that video a few weeks back. And that is from a client who was a caretaker and also a small business owner. Now, you can imagine this would be so overwhelming. And part of what she was doing was not only caring for her children, caring for the people that were in her own kind of primary family, but she also had ended up being the sibling that was caring for her elderly parents. Now, this had ended up being quite expensive and quite time-consuming, which you will know if you have been through this elder care experience. But as we were kind of thinking about, well, what are the pieces of expertise? The main thing that she wanted to lean on was the expertise of experiencing growing a business while being the primary caretaker. Now, as we kind of talked about that, I realized that there were some holes in how she was kind of thinking about it, because there was a part of her that was saying, but I'm not a doctor. But I'm not any kind of like an occupational therapist. I'm not somebody that has training on how to kind of do the elder care thing. Except she sure did, didn't she? If you are doing that thing, if you have been doing that thing, and if you sat down to write a book that required you to analyze all those things you've done, you are absolutely an expert. And sometimes all it takes is just reframing, just tweaking the way we're thinking about this just a little bit. Now, where I see this go awry often is folks who are really resistant to claiming expertise. And I want to give an example that this is an older example as well. This is a person that I worked with who has unfortunately now passed away. And in the end, he was actually okay with his memoir not being marketable, but I still think this is a really, really good example because we had worked through his book. It had a really clear topic, had a really clear message. But one of the things that he was really resistant to was claiming any kind of expertise. Now, this was an older gentleman, I believe still from the silent generation, and part of his struggle was that he had really grown up being taught a lot of humility, that you didn't kind of stand up and say you were, any better at anything than anybody else. And unfortunately, what this meant was that he was just really not comfortable talking about his book at all. At all. He just did not want to. And every time I kind of tried to nudge him, even for maybe like a local library appearance or some kind of a signing among family and friends, he really just felt like he didn't want to do that. And part of it was when we talked about, what could you talk about? He was like, it's just my story. Who cares? Well, that is not true. There was a really clear, really powerful theme in that book about what it means to parent with love, about how much more important time spent with your children is than money that you can give them, either as inheritance or kind of in the moment. There were a lot of things that I think many, many people would have been really excited to hear from him about, but he just simply could not wrap his head around it. He decided in the end that he would rather not have that kind of expertise, have that kind of performative presence. He would rather not have that and just deal with not having a marketable memoir. That is okay if that is your choice. But again, I just want to make sure that I let you know all of the things that will be expected, particularly if you are pitching to traditionals or agents. Okay, the fifth component of every marketable memoir, or penultimate component, is a promotion strategy. Now, this is another thing that's really going to come straight out of the book proposal format. Whenever you are submitting a book proposal to agents or traditional publishers, you are always going to be expected to include a promotion plan. Now, I find that this throws a lot of people off their game because so many people think the reason that they want to have that traditional publisher is so they don't have to do marketing. If you have been listening to this podcast for long, you know that that is unfortunately a pretty pervasive myth. Publishers do not do all your marketing for you, and they won't do any promotion because the promotion is you being in front of your audience. You're the only one that can do that. And that is why traditionals and agents really want to know that you have a plan for marketing the memoir. Now, even if you are not going for a traditional, even if you're not doing the book proposal querying thing, you will still, and even more so, need a promotion plan. Because if you are self-publishing, it's all on you. And if you haven't kind of wrapped your head around what it's going to mean to promote this book, you're going to really be struggling from day one. So what do I mean by a promotion plan? Well, often we will talk about this in the nonfiction circles as platform, meaning how are you getting in front of the people who are interested in what you have to say? Now, we have tons of videos and blog posts on this, and in fact, the easiest way to figure this out is to head over to pageandpodium.com/blog, and there you'll be able to select by topic. You can choose marketing. That will give you a lot of information about how to build your platform, how to promote your book. But the main thing I want to say here is that the most important thing is that you have chosen one promotion strategy that you like to do. The thing that throws so many people off with their promotion is they feel so stuck that they have to do the same things everybody else has been doing. So I've got to do keynote speeches. But if you hate doing keynote speeches, you're not going to do it. You're not going to pitch yourself. You're not going to improve your craft. You're just not going to do it. And that is not going to be an effective promotion strategy. Instead, what I want you to do is think about what types of activities would feel really good to you. And as kind of a secondary piece, what's your audience doing? Most people I find when they write a memoir, they actually really do want to connect with their audience. And this is a great chance to kind of think about what is the commonality between what you like doing, what you would enjoy, what you could consistently do for ideally years, and what your audience likes to hear. So that might be in some of the examples I mentioned earlier that have this kind of NPR type crowd. Podcast interviews are a great way to reach them. You also might think about Instagram Reels or TikTok videos. That can be a really, really great place, especially if you are doing some of the kind of left-leaning, some of the kind of socially engaged type of discussion. I see a lot of people do really well there with like mental health and self-care and identity. Those are really great places if you're in that kind of a world. But again, I only want you to do these things if they are things that you enjoy. And as you are pitching to your traditionals, if that's something that you end up doing, it will really serve you to have that plan in place and ideally to begin to do some of that promotion even as you're querying, just to kind of get your feet wet, make sure you do like doing that thing, and kind of get some momentum under that promotion plan before you get moving forward. Okay, and the last component of every marketable memoir, I saved this one for last because it's the one everybody thinks should be first, and that is good writing. Now, as I teased in the beginning of this video, we just a few weeks ago did a video on what makes a memoir good. So you can go check that out, learn a little bit more about what we mean by good. But all we mean here is that we have some conflict, we have change, we have movement forward toward a point. These are kind of the pieces of narrative, pieces of structure that we need. And there is consistent writing. The voice feels consistent, the storytelling feels consistent. That really is all there is to it. I often find that people will come to me and they want some kind of magical potion, magical template to make their memoir good. But really, a good memoir means so many things. It depends on your audience, it depends on you, it depends on what feels good and authentic in your writing process, depends on the message you want to get across. There are so many things that go into a good memoir. Really, the only thing that we can do to make sure our memoir is good is pay attention to our structure and make sure our voice is consistent. Now, if those are things that you would like help with, those and actually all of these things are things we talk about in our women's group program for memoir writers, the Memoir Method. If you are interested in joining us in there to really get some kind of behind the scenes help, some workshopping and feedback on things like your core topic and your key message, if you want some support in making sure your voice is refined and consistent throughout, if it would be helpful to have community cheering you on, accountability, making sure you're making progress, I hope that you will join us in the Memoir Method. You can read more at pageandpodium.com/memoir-method. Okay, I want to close this video by just once again drawing a distinction between what we mean when we talk about a marketable memoir and a good memoir. These are, again, not the same thing. And while, of course, we need to make sure that your memoir is of a good quality, you want that, I know. The big thing when we think about marketability is not making the memoir better and better and better and better. Remember, better is not going to differentiate you from the market. Rather, what we want to do is make sure that we know what should be highlighted in the book to give it the best chance of getting into readers' hands. That's what agents are looking for. That's what traditional publishers are looking for. That's what hybrid publishers are looking for. And it's what you should be looking for, even if you are self-publishing. So as you are finishing up your memoir manuscript and transitioning into this marketing phase, I hope this has been a really helpful way to think about things. When you're thinking about making sure that your memoir is marketable, the last thing I want to leave you with is knowing that when you write that memoir, the most important thing is that it is authentic and true. If those things are not in place, no promotion strategies in this universe are going to help you sell it. It is just not going to be marketable. So, in case anyone was thinking that they were going to scrap their writing plan and replace it with something that might be more marketable, don't do that. Instead, I want you to think about what is authentic to you and how you can frame or angle that message into something that is already marketable. Because I bet it is. I bet you've got it. And all you need is a little bit of editing and a little bit of refinement. If I can help with that, let me know. And otherwise, happy writing. You know that feeling when a book just hits you? Not because the story is wild, but because it's shaped so intentionally that it almost makes you rethink your own story. You finish that last page and think, how did they do that? The structure, the honesty, the clarity. There's something under the surface that you just can't put your finger on. And the reason is, unless someone shows you how memoirs actually work, it's hard to translate that inspiration into your own writing. And that's exactly why we created the Memoir Method Monthly Book Club. If you want to join Emily Thrash every single month to dig into an exemplary memoir and figure out what's happening under the surface, head over to pageandpodium.com/book club. Your first month is free, and we can't wait to welcome you to the group.